Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of just like pure, unfiltered precision.
Oh, absolutely, like engineering.
Right. Yeah, exactly like engineering. You go in, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line fracturing the bone, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is.
Yeah, it's completely binary. I mean, it's either broken or it's not.
Exactly. It's clean. It's definitive. And, as a patient, that's incredibly comforting. We like things to be visible and mathematically sound.
We need them to be, yeah.
Right. But when you step out of the hospital and into the criminal justice system, specifically into the world of like these complex, highly publicized homicide investigations, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, it's gone. Yeah.
You aren't looking at clean lines anymore. You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, entirely dependent on the messy, subjective lens of human interpretation.
It is the absolute definition of muddy waters. I mean, you're relying on human memory, which we know degrades. You're relying on human eyesight, which is deeply flawed. And you're relying on human bias, which is just inescapable.
And today, we are immersing you in a deep dive that exemplifies those muddy waters better than, honestly, almost any other case in the modern era. We're talking about the Delphi murders.
The February 2017 homicides of 13-year-old Abigail Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German in Delphi, Indiana.
Now, if you are familiar with this case, you probably know the timeline, you know the tragic beats, but we're bypassing the standard chronological walkthrough today.
Yeah, we aren't just going to rattle off a list of systemic police errors or, command center failures.
Exactly. Because treating a tragedy like a sterile timeline removes the variables that actually drive the investigation, the human beings.
The people, exactly.
Right. Our mission in this deep dive is to focus intensely, almost uncomfortably, on the people. We're going to examine the highly specific backgrounds of the individuals who shaped this case.
And we're going to look at the raw, uncensored physical realities of the crime scene they either left behind or, were forced to analyze.
Right. And we're going to walk you right up to the very latest updates leading into the highly anticipated 2026 appellate hearings.
Because as a listener, to truly understand how a single unspent bullet found in the dirt or how a single misfiled piece of paper in a cardboard box led to a man receiving a 130-year prison sentence, you absolutely have to understand the psychologies involved.
You really do.
You cannot separate the physical evidence from the specific backgrounds of the alternative suspects, the witnesses, and the professionals who handled that evidence.
Right. So as you listen today, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of an investigator staring at a database that has just crossed the threshold of 14,000 tips.
Wow, 14,000.
14,000. At that volume, how do you separate an actual viable suspect from the chaotic noise of community paranoia without losing the thread completely?
It's an incredibly daunting task, mathematically speaking. I mean, when you have that sheer volume of information, human bias inevitably creeps in as a survival mechanism.
Yeah, you just need a narrative to cling to.
Exactly. Investigators start looking for narratives that fit the physical evidence they have. But if the physical evidence is anomalous, if the crime scene itself is bizarre or contradictory, the net you cast to find suspects ends up catching some very strange, very dark things.
Which brings us to, honestly, the most sobering part of this analysis.
Yeah.
Because we cannot understand the profiles of the people investigated over the past decade without first understanding the unvarnished reality of what happened to Abby and Libby on February 13, 2017, near the Moon and High Bridge Trail.
No, you have to look at the ground truth first.
Right. We have to look at the autopsy findings from forensic pathologist Dr. Roland Kaur. And while these details are graphic, they are the foundational physical logistics of this crime.
They absolutely are. The specific medical terminology Dr. Kaur used provides the literal groundwork for every legal and investigative theory that follows.
So what did he find, specifically?
Well, according to his deposition, the cause of death for both girls was exsanguination resulting from severe lacerations to the neck.
Exsanguination, meaning catastrophic blood loss. They bled to death.
Yes. But the specific nature of the wounds is where the forensic analysis becomes incredibly complex. Abigail Williams suffered a 5 to 6 centimeter incised wound on the left side of her neck.
Okay. And Liberty's trauma was different, right?
It was. Liberty German sustained multiple neck lacerations. And crucially, Dr. Kaur identified 5 distinct tool marks on the margins of the wound on the right side of her neck.
Wait, hold on. Break that down for me mechanically. 5 distinct tool marks on the actual wound margin. What does that specifically tell a forensic pathologist about the weapon or, the interaction?
Think about what happens when a blade meets tissue. A clean, single swipe with a perfectly sharp blade leaves a smooth, continuous margin.
Like a scalpel.
Right, like a scalpel. A tool mark on a wound margin, however, implies something different. It often points to a serrated blade, or a blade that was drawn back and forth multiple times in a sawing motion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Or a weapon that has specific physical imperfections, like nicks or chips in the metal, that leave an imprint on the tissue as it cuts.
So it's messy.
Very messy. From a behavioral perspective, it indicates a very violent, prolonged physical struggle. It's not a surgical strike. It's a frantic, forceful interaction.
God. And Dr. Kaur estimated the time of death occurred within a 24 to 48-hour window prior to the autopsy, which squarely matches the timeline of their disappearance on the afternoon of February 13th.
It does, yeah.
But the trauma to their bodies is only half of the anomalous nature of this crime scene. We have to talk about the staging.
Yes, the staging is critical.
Because when the bodies were discovered on February 14th, about a half-mile upstream from the bridge near Deer Creek, they were found in a state that completely baffled the initial response teams.
The physical state of the victims strongly suggested intentional, deliberate staging by the perpetrator. I mean, the scene had been manipulated.
Liberty German was found entirely nude, and she was covered in blood.
Mm.
But Abigail Williams was found fully clothed, except she wasn't in her own clothes.
No.
Abigail was found dressed in Liberty's garments. And the sources note that the clothing was damp, and several other articles of clothing were found either discarded nearby or actually submerged in the cold waters of Deer Creek.
If we connect this specific detail, the clothing swap, to the legal battles that happen years later, it becomes the absolute crux of the defense's argument regarding how many people were present.
Because of how physically hard that is to do.
Exactly. You have to really visualize the physical logistics required to accomplish that in a woodland environment.
Let me try to put this into an analogy to capture the sheer physical friction of this, because I think people underestimate how hard it is to move a human body.
Oh, they definitely do.
Imagine you're trying to put a thick, wet wetsuit onto a heavy, completely uncooperative mannequin. Only you aren't in a sterile room.
Well,
You are standing in the middle of a forest.
right.
The ground is covered in leaves and uneven roots. The clothing itself is damp from the environment or the creek. And most importantly, your adrenaline is spiking because you are terrified of being detected by a hiker, a dog walker, or a search party.
It's an incredibly apt analogy, but the biological reality is even more difficult than a mannequin.
How so?
Well, you're maneuvering a deceased human body, which involves entirely dead weight, a complete lack of joint cooperation, and, depending on the timeline, the potential early onset of rigor mortis.
They get stiff.
Exactly. The defense specifically pointed out the sheer number of layers involved. To dress Abigail's body in Liberty's clothes, the perpetrator had to secure a black bra, then a secondary gray sports bra, a pink shirt, and finally pull a sweatshirt over all of that.
I mean, just putting a damp sports bra onto a compliant, living person who is actively helping you is a frustrating, physically demanding task. Doing it to a deceased victim in the woods feels almost impossible for one person.
Exactly. The level of physical dexterity, the extended time it would take, and the sheer physical exhaustion required to accomplish this under the immediate threat of discovery is immense.
It just doesn't fit a lone killer profile.
The defense argued vehemently that a single perpetrator, acting alone in a panicked post-homicide state, simply could not have achieved this. They argued this logistical hurdle points undeniably to multiple actors operating in coordination, managing the weight and the environment together.
And the bizarre nature of the staging didn't stop with the clothing swap.
Yeah.
The bodies were also partially covered with tree branches and twigs.
Yes.
And these weren't just randomly tossed over them like a pile of leaves. The branches were arranged in a distinct, deliberate V or cross-shaped pattern over the victims.
This is exactly where the subjective interpretation of a crime scene begins to dictate the entire trajectory of an investigation.
How so?
You have prosecution witness Brian Olahy, an investigator with the Indiana State Police. He looked at those branches and testified that this placement was nothing more than a crude, hasty attempt at concealment.
Just hiding them from view.
Right. In his view, it was a single panicked killer grabbing whatever was nearby to obscure the bodies from the air or from a distance.
But the alternative theory, which became a massive point of contention, is that this arrangement was not meant to conceal anything at all. It was meant to display.
Exactly. The theory was that this was a meticulous, symbolic arrangement.
And that debate, was it a panicked, sloppy cover-up or a deliberate ritualistic display, creates a perfect natural bridge to the people who were initially suspected of this crime.
It does.
Because when a crime scene is that strange, and when the logistics suggest multiple people, the investigative net has to be thrown incredibly wide.
And that net pulled in several local individuals whose specific backgrounds and behaviors were deeply, deeply troubling. I mean, the initial 5-year phase of this investigation didn't just sit idle.
No, it went everywhere.
It went down several massive, complex avenues that, while ultimately resulting in no initial charges for the murders themselves, uncovered a labyrinth of other criminal activity in the area.
Let's start with the digital footprint of this case, because in the modern era, that is almost always the first major avenue. We have to introduce a man named Keegan Kline.
Right, Keegan Kline.
He is from Peru, Indiana, and he lived with his father, Jerry Tony Kline. Now, Keegan Kline's background is deeply systematically rooted in severe online exploitation.
Yeah, his whole digital life was built around it.
He created and ran a fictitious catfishing profile on social media using the name Anthony Shots. And the entire purpose of this profile was to solicit underage girls for sexually explicit photographs and communications.
What's fascinating here from an investigative timeline standpoint is how incredibly fast the authorities traced this digital thread.
Oh, really? How fast?
Just 11 days after the homicides, less than 2 weeks, federal and state investigators executed a massive search warrant at the residence Keegan shared with his father. They seized numerous electronic devices, phones, computers, everything.
Wow, 11 days. And the reason they hit that specific house with a warrant so fast is chilling. They discovered through data extraction that Liberty German's phone had been in direct contact with this Anthony Shots profile shortly before she was murdered.
That's the terrifying part.
In fact, Keegan Kline actually admitted during police interviews that his fictitious account communicated with Liberty on the exact day she vanished. He even admitted they had discussed meeting up at the trail.
But he steadfastly, repeatedly denied any physical involvement in the actual murders, and investigators did not take that at face value. They pressed him incredibly hard.
I would hope so.
Yeah, the transcripts show they repeatedly questioned him about whether his father, Tony, or perhaps another local associate, had accessed his devices to execute the catfishing scheme, and then actually showed up at the Monon High Bridge Trail to ambush the girls.
As a listener, you're probably thinking, well, if he arranged to meet her the day she died, how is he not the prime suspect? What does this mean for Keegan Kline today?
Right.
Well, he was never charged with the Delphi homicides. However, his digital background caught up with him in a massive way. Because of the devices seized in the Delphi probe, he was arrested in 2020 on 30 unrelated counts of child pornography and exploitation.
30 counts.
Yeah. And in 2023, he received a 40-year prison sentence. So he is currently locked away, serving significant time, but technically not for the murders of Abby and Libby.
Right. And while the digital forensics teams were chasing the complex Anthony Shots web, another massive avenue of investigation was happening right at the physical geographical location of the crime scene.
Which brings us to Ron Logan.
Exactly. This brings us to a local property owner named Ron Logan.
Ron Logan owned the physical stretch of land, the wooded property near Deer Creek, where the girls' bodies were actually discovered. And just logically, in a case like this, the property owner is always going to be scrutinized.
Absolutely. Who knows the terrain better?
Right. In March 2017, investigators executed a search warrant on Logan's property. And this wasn't just standard procedure. This was after receiving multiple tips from community members who suspected his involvement. The town was pointing fingers at the guy who owned the land.
But Logan died in 2020. He was never officially charged with the murders, and importantly, the authorities never formally cleared him either. He just remained in this bizarre investigative limbo, a ghost in the case file.
Now, this is where the web of these alternative suspects gets wildly entangled. Because years after the murders, long after Ron Logan died, the defense teams for the man ultimately convicted brought forward a staggering claim.
Yeah, this was in February 2025.
Right. In February 2025, they filed a motion based on letters from a jailhouse informant, an Indiana prison inmate named Richie Davis.
Yes. Davis came forward and claimed that while he was incarcerated, Keegan Kline, the catfisher, and Ron Logan, the property owner, actually communicated with each other and shared child pornography.
Which sounds completely insane. And it goes even further than digital sharing. Davis asserted that Ron Logan explicitly confessed to him that a three-man conspiracy was behind the Delphi murders.
A three-man conspiracy.
Yeah. According to this inmate, Logan identified himself and Keegan Kline as two of the perpetrators, refused to name the third man, and explicitly stated that Richard Allen, the man who was eventually convicted, was entirely 100% uninvolved.
Right.
So I have to ask, when you are analyzing these backgrounds in the psychology of the prison system, is there any actual mechanism that makes a connection between a young digital catfisher and an older property owner credible? Or is this just the ultimate example of fabricated prison gossip?
You have to view jailhouse informants through an incredibly skeptical, almost cynical lens. I mean, the mechanics of the prison informant system are built on desperation.
Right, they want a deal.
Inmates trade sensational stories for sentence reductions or better housing assignments. The Carroll County prosecutor, Nicholas McClelland, strongly refuted Davis's entire narrative.
How did he refute it?
Well, McClelland argued a few key mechanical points. First, Davis's claims about how the murders actually happened physically simply didn't match the forensic evidence at the crime scene. He had the details wrong. Second, McClelland attached letters showing that Keegan Kline himself had dismissed Davis as, quote, an idiot who was just trying to trade fabricated stories for a lighter sentence.
The classic Smitch motive. I'll give you a massive conspiracy if you shave 5 years off my time.
Exactly. And most importantly, from an evidentiary standpoint, McClelland stated there was absolutely no empirical evidence, no cross-referenced phone records, no shared digital footprints, no witness sightings to suggest that Ron Logan and Keegan Kline ever even crossed paths or knew each other.
Let alone coordinated a complex triple homicide conspiracy.
Exactly. It just wasn't there.
Okay, so you have the digital predator avenue, and you had the property owner avenue. But there was a third major alternative suspect profile. And this one relies heavily on that strange V-shaped branch arrangement we discussed with the staging.
Right, the Odinism theory.
We need to shift to a man named Brad Holder. And his background introduces a completely different, highly controversial element to this case. Odinism.
Odinism, in its purest form, is a modern revival of ancient Norse paganism. It involves the worship of the Old Norse pantheon. And Brad Holder was a confirmed practicing Odinist in the local area.
Okay.
What drew the defense's attention to him wasn't just his religion, but his highly specific social media footprint. His accounts featured images of stick arrangements, runic symbols, and physical poses that eerily, almost perfectly, mirrored the anomalous staging found at the crime scene.
And I want to be clear for the listener, this wasn't just a fringe, desperate defense theory thrown at the wall years later to confuse a jury. Law enforcement took this seriously from day one.
Oh, very seriously.
Within a week of the murders in 2017, the Carroll County Sheriff actually requested formal assistance from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the BAU, specifically to evaluate potential ritualistic elements at the scene.
Which is a huge step.
Yeah, they even consulted a Purdue University professor who looked at the photos and agreed that the branch arrangements on the girls' bodies could absolutely be interpreted as Norse runes.
And the physical evidence goes deeper than just the branches. An undercover state trooper, analyzing the scene, identified a specific mark on a tree trunk near the bodies.
In blood, right.
Yes, it was rendered in blood, and it closely resembled a Fehu rune, which is a specific known symbol in the ancient runic alphabet often associated with wealth or life force.
Wow.
The defense later brought in an expert, Dr. Dawn Perlmutter, who is a specialist in ritualistic crimes. She analyzed the scene and identified 7 distinct hallmarks of a Norse pagan ritual present in the staging of the bodies and the environment.
So you have a crime scene that experts say looks ritualistic. You have a local man who practices Odinism, posting similar stick structures online. And you have the FBI actively investigating the pagan angle.
Right. It's a massive amount of circumstantial alignment.
You have a massive web of online predators, property owners, and ritualistic conspirators. But then, incredibly, the entire lens of the investigation abruptly shifts. It pivots away from all of these dark, complex backgrounds to a man whose life couldn't have seemed more ordinary.
It's just wild how fast it changes.
And it all happened because of a single, physical piece of paper.
This is one of the most staggering procedural pivots in the history of modern investigations. We transition from tracking digital predators and ancient runes to a local 52-year-old pharmacy technician named Richard Matthew Allen.
That's a local guy.
Yeah. And he was brought back into the spotlight not by a massive forensic breakthrough, not by DNA, but by the meticulous, quiet attention to detail of a volunteer.
We have to profile Kathy Shank. Her background is so vital to understanding how the mundane mechanics of a massive investigation actually work. She was a retired child welfare worker.
Right.
She wasn't a hardened detective. She was volunteering her time to help organize the massive backlog of case files because the investigative agency was preparing to relocate to a new building.
Just doing admin work.
Literally. In September 2022, she's going through a physical cardboard box in a filing cabinet drawer, and she pulls out a manila folder labeled tip #74.
Now remember the volume of the database we discussed earlier? 14,000 tips. Tip #74 was generated incredibly early on. It was filed on February 16th, 2017.
Wow.
That is just 3 days after the murders.
On that day, in 2017, Richard Allen walked in on his own volition and self-reported to Conservation Officer Dan Doolin. He stated that he had been walking on the Monon High Bridge Trail during the exact critical afternoon window when the girls disappeared.
He put himself right there.
He did. He said he was there from approximately 1:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. He explicitly stated he was dressed in a blue utility jacket and jeans. And he said he observed 3 juvenile females walking near the bridge.
He essentially placed himself at the exact time and physical location of the abduction, wearing clothing that perfectly, almost identically matched the description of the bridge guy suspect, the man that Liberty German had heroically managed to record on her cell phone video just moments before the attack.
If he matched the video and he placed himself there, how did he walk free for 5 years?
Well, it was a mistake.
Right. His statement was misfiled. It was filed under the incorrect name, Richard Allen Whiteman. Why? Because of a simple human clerical error in a chaotic command center. The tip was mistakenly marked as cleared, shoved in a box, and lost for over 5 years.
Over 5 years. Just sitting in a box.
Until Kathy Shank, the retired child welfare worker, looked at it with fresh eyes. She noticed a very subtle discrepancy. The label on the folder said the name was Whiteman, but the narrative report inside noted that the individual actually resided on a estate called Whiteman Drive.
It's exactly the kind of subtle administrative discrepancy that a trained social worker, someone whose entire career involved reading dense case files closely to protect children, catches.
Yeah, she was trained to look for those tiny errors.
She compared the documents, realized the tip actually belonged to a man named Richard Matthew Allen, and on September 21st, 2022, she delivered that corrected, unified tip sheet to lead investigator Tony Liggett.
And just like that.
In an instant, Richard Allen is pulled from absolute obscurity and placed squarely in the center of the suspect pool.
So let's look at Richard Allen's background.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, he's a local Delphi resident. He worked at a local pharmacy. He is not a known criminal mastermind with a rap sheet.
No, not at all.
On October 13, 2022, investigators Steve Mullen and Tony Liggett go to his house to formally interview him. He sits down, and he confirms exactly what he said in 2017. Yes, I was on the trail. Yes, those were my clothes. But he fiercely, aggressively denied any involvement whatsoever in the murders. He looked at them and said, "You're not going to find anything that ties me to those murders."
And when the investigators pressed him on the timeline, pointing out his undeniable proximity to the victims at the exact hour they vanished, Allen's reaction was highly defensive.
How did he react?
He accused the investigators of attempting to make him a fall guy to close a cold case, demanded that they either arrest him right then and there or let him leave, and he physically stormed out of the interview.
But his admission of being on the trail in those clothes gave them enough probable cause to execute a search warrant at his home, where they seized his firearms.
Right.
Now, before we dive into the ballistics and the physical evidence they found, we have to look at the backgrounds of the eyewitnesses who put a man matching his description on that trail. Because the defense argued heavily that the people who claimed to see someone that day didn't actually describe the 52-year-old Richard Allen.
The eyewitness testimony in this case is a masterclass in how human memory is malleable and fraught with contradictions.
It really is.
Let's look at a witness named Sarah Carbaugh. She was a Delphi resident who testified that she saw a man walking along Route 300N near the trail at approximately 4 p.m. on the day of the murders.
Okay, so right around the right time.
Right. She described him as hunched up, walking with his hands firmly in his pockets, wearing what she called a funky hat. And crucially, at trial, she testified that he was covered in mud and blood.
Wait, hold on. I have to play devil's advocate here, because the defense hammered her on cross-examination about the massive evolution of her memory.
Oh, they tore it apart.
First, she claims she saw a man walking down the road covered in blood, but she waited 3 full weeks to call the police.
3 weeks.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag for the defense.
Second, her description of the man's clothing physically changed over time. In her very first interview, she told police his coat was tan. In her second interview, after the video of the suspect in a blue jacket was released, she changed her description to say his coat was blue.
And the most glaring, troubling issue with her memory. In her first 2 police interviews, she made absolutely no mention of the word blood.
None at all.
None. That was a highly inflammatory detail that she only introduced in her third interview. This is a known psychological phenomenon. Memory is not a video recording. It is malleable.
It shifts based on what you hear.
Over time, continuous exposure to media coverage, community rumors, and suggestive questioning can fundamentally alter what a witness genuinely believes they saw. Then you have another key witness, Betsy Blair, another local resident walking the trail. She testified to seeing a car backed into a spot near the abandoned CPS building that afternoon. But her physical description of the suspect she saw, the man believed to be a bridge guy, was that he was boyish and youthful.
Which is a sharp, undeniable contrast to the physical reality of the suspect.
Very sharp.
Richard Allen was 52 years old at the time of the murders. He had a receding hairline and a goatee. Boyish and youthful are not descriptors typically applied to a middle-aged man in his 50s.
The defense also brought up several other trail walkers who saw an unfamiliar man who ignored them, and a resident living across the creek who saw an unrecognized man standing near her mailboxes.
Right.
The overarching point that the defense was trying to make is there were multiple unidentified individuals in that wooded area that afternoon. It wasn't just a closed ecosystem containing only Richard Allen and the two girls.
Despite these glaring eyewitness discrepancies, and despite his adamant, continuous denials, the accumulation of his own timeline admission and the matching clothing description was enough.
It was enough to arrest him.
Richard Allen was officially taken into custody on October 26, 2022. And this arrest initiated a profound, rapid deterioration of his mental state, bringing another key professional into the narrative and highlighting a deeply troubling, controversial aspect of his pretrial detention.
This brings us to a part of the deep dive where we have to issue a warning, because the details of what happened to Richard Allen while he was awaiting trial are incredibly graphic, disturbing, and frankly hard to hear.
They are very tough to listen to.
But again, to understand the people involved and the evidence generated, we cannot censor this reality. We have to look at Richard Allen's psychological background. Before his arrest, he was not a perfectly healthy individual.
No, he wasn't.
He had a documented medical history of major depressive disorder. He had actually been hospitalized for severe suicidal ideation 3 years prior to his arrest.
So you have an individual entering the system with a pre-existing, severe, documented mental health vulnerability. And the harsh conditions of his pretrial detention violently collided with that psychological background.
Yeah, violently is the right word.
Following his arrest, Allen was subjected to what the state calls a safekeeping order.
Can you explain the actual legal mechanism of a safekeeping order? Why wasn't he just in the local county jail?
A safekeeping order is a legal mechanism that allows a judge to transfer a pretrial detainee, someone who has not been convicted, out of a local county jail and into a state prison facility.
Usually for safety, right?
Right. Usually this is done if the local jail cannot ensure the inmate's physical safety due to the high-profile nature of the crime, or if they require specialized medical care the county can't provide. So under this order, Allen was transferred to Westville Correctional Facility, which is not a local lockup. It is an adult maximum security state prison.
And he wasn't just placed in the general population of the prison. He was placed in continuous, extreme solitary confinement. And he was kept there for 13 months. Let me repeat that, because the timeline is staggering. 13 months in an 8x10 cell alone.
This is a critical procedural and psychological point. The Indiana Department of Correction, or IDOC, has specific policies regarding solitary confinement, particularly concerning inmates with serious documented mental illnesses.
They usually limit it, right?
Exactly. The standard policy restricts solitary confinement for these individuals to a maximum of 30 days because the psychological damage of extreme isolation is well documented and severe. Allen was kept in those conditions for over a year in direct violation of that standard timeline, despite his known depressive disorder.
The psychological mechanics of what happened to him are terrifying. The descent into absolute psychosis was total. His physical health collapsed first. His weight plummeted from a healthy 180 pounds down to a frail 135 pounds. He was physically wasting away.
He was a shell of himself.
And then his behaviors became unimaginably extreme. He was tearing up his confidential legal mail. He was drinking raw toilet water. He was literally eating the pages of his Bible.
It's horrific.
He was rhythmically hitting his head against the steel door of his cell. He self-harmed using a plastic spork, and he began covering his body and his cell walls in feces, spit, and vomit.
From a clinical perspective, he suffered a complete psychological fracture. prolonged sensory deprivation and isolation cause cortisol levels to spike, executive functioning to collapse, and reality to blur.
You just lose touch with everything.
You do. And it was in this state of severe, documented, unmedicated psychosis that the state obtained its most damaging evidence for the trial.
The confessions.
Yes. Over those 13 months of isolation, Allen allegedly made over 60 confessions to various people. He confessed to his wife, his mother, the prison warden, the correctional officers guarding his door, and to his prison psychologist.
He told everyone.
In recorded, monitored phone calls to his wife, Kathy, he explicitly, tearfully stated, "I did it. I killed Abby and Libby."
Which brings us directly to the prison psychologist who oversaw this breakdown. We need to critically profile Dr. Monica Walla. She was the IDOC psychologist specifically tasked with treating Allen during this horrific 13-month deterioration.
Right.
She is the professional who took the stand and testified about his confessions during their clinical sessions, claiming he detailed specific things like throat slitting and the placement of the branches.
But Dr. Walla's own background and professional behavior raised massive, almost unbelievable conflict of interest questions that the defense aggressively attacked.
Oh, so.
During her cross-examination, she openly admitted that she actively listened to true crime podcasts about the Delphi case, specifically podcasts theorizing about Richard Allen's guilt for hours daily during her commute to the prison.
Wait, really?
Yes. Furthermore, she actively posted about the case and her opinions on social media platforms.
I have to use an analogy here to explain why this is so fundamentally compromising, because it is wild. Imagine you are going into the hospital for a highly complex, potentially life-threatening surgery on a unique anatomical issue.
Okay.
And right before you go under, you find out your surgeon, while scrubbing in, was watching TikToks made by amateur internet sleuths, speculating about your specific anatomy, and then tweeting their own theories about it. It crosses every conceivable professional ethical boundary.
It's a huge violation.
How can a psychologist provide objective clinical care or objectively evaluate whether a confession is real or a product of psychosis when they are consuming media that inherently presumes their patient's guilt?
The defense argued exactly that point. They argued that these confessions were not genuine admissions of guilt, but the product of unconstitutional coercion, an involuntary, broken response to being psychologically tortured in solitary confinement.
And they had proof it was psychosis, didn't they?
They did. To prove this, they pointed out the mechanical flaws in his statements. Many of the confessions contained demonstrably false physical details.
Like what?
For instance, in several confessions, Allen claimed he shot the girls in the back. But as we know definitively from Dr. Kaur's autopsy, neither girl sustained a gunshot wound of any kind. A person in their right mind knows how they committed a crime. A person in psychosis grabs at terrifying concepts.
But despite the physically false details, and despite her own admission of podcast consumption, Dr. Walla testified confidently in court that Allen's confessions were, quote, logical and organized.
Which is hard to reconcile.
And here is the procedural kicker that really highlights the control of the courtroom. While she is on the stand testifying to how logical and sane he sounded, the jury is watching a video of his confinement. But the judge ordered that the video be completely muted.
Muted, wow.
Yes, muted. The jury could see him pacing, but they couldn't hear his disjointed screams or the context of his breakdown.
This intense battle over Allen's mental state, the clinical validity of his confessions, and the draconian conditions of his confinement set the stage for an incredibly contentious trial.
It really did.
It was a trial dominated by a remarkably strict judge and by a highly subjective, deeply debated piece of physical evidence.
Let's profile the judge who ran this courtroom. Special Judge Fran Gull from Allen County. Her judicial background is that of a magistrate known for maintaining incredibly tight, uncompromising control over her courtroom proceedings.
Very strict.
And in the Delphi case, she exerted that control immediately and forcefully. In December 2022, right after the arrest, she issued a strict gag order barring all attorneys, police, and family members from commenting publicly on the case.
But the real procedural explosion, the moment the legal community gasped, happened in October 2023. A significant, devastating leak of confidential case materials occurred.
Oh, the photos.
Yes. Highly graphic crime scene photographs of the victims were leaked to the public internet, and the source of the leak was traced directly back to the law office of Andrew Baldwin, one of Allen's primary defense attorneys.
How did that even happen?
A former associate of his had apparently walked into a conference room, seen the evidence left out on a table, photographed it, and shared it.
So Judge Gull, discovering this, calls Baldwin and his co-counsel, Brad Rossi, into a private, closed-door chambers meeting. She aggressively accuses them of gross negligence and incompetence for failing to secure the evidence, and she essentially forces them to withdraw from the case entirely under the direct threat of publicly disqualifying them and ruining their reputations.
This maneuver caused extreme procedural friction and panic within the Indiana legal system.
I bet.
The defense attorneys didn't just accept it, they filed an interlocutory appeal.
Which means pausing the trial, right?
Yes, it's a legal mechanism where you pause the trial proceedings to ask a higher court to rule on a specific crucial issue before the trial can continue. They petitioned the Indiana Supreme Court, and in a rare move, in January 2024, the High Court actually ruled in favor of the defense.
They sided with Baldwin and Rozzi.
They did. They found that Judge Gall had bypassed constitutional protections and exceeded her judicial authority by forcing the withdrawals in secret without holding a formal public evidentiary hearing. They officially reinstated Baldwin and Rozzi to the case.
But the friction between the judge and the defense team didn't stop there. It escalated. Because Judge Gall also made a massive pretrial ruling that fundamentally, structurally altered the entire trial.
This is the big one.
She entirely barred the defense from bringing up the Odinism theory. She completely locked out any mention of Brad Holder, the Bloody Feehoo rune, or the alternative suspect timelines.
On what grounds?
She ruled that the defense lacked a sufficient nexus, a direct evidentiary link, to tie those people to the actual murders. The jury would not hear a single word about the ritual theory.
Which meant the scope of the trial was drastically narrowed. It focused almost exclusively on Allen's confessions, the heavily debated eyewitnesses, the misfiled tip, and one single highly contested piece of physical evidence, the unspent bullet.
Let's introduce the expert behind this evidence. Melissa Oberg. She is a forensic firearms examiner with the Indiana State Police. Her entire job at trial was to definitively tie a single unspent .40 caliber Smith & Wesson round, which was found buried in the dirt between the victims' bodies, to Richard Allen's Sig Sauer handgun, which was seized from his home 5 years later.
The scientific discipline she relied on is called tool mark analysis. To understand the controversy, you have to understand the basic forensic mechanics of a firearm.
Break it down for us.
When you load a live cartridge into the chamber of a semi-automatic gun and then subsequently extract it, the internal hardened steel mechanisms of the gun leave microscopic imperfections, scratches, and gouges on the softer brass casing of the bullet.
Like a fingerprint.
Essentially, yes. Specifically, the extractor hook aggressively grips the rim of the cartridge to pull it backward, and the ejector block violently scratches the side of the casing to push it out of the ejection port. Oberg testified that she visually matched the tool marks on the crime scene bullet to test rounds fired from Allen's gun.
That sounds like a solid match, right? But wait, let's look at the actual physics of this. The defense completely dismantled the objectivity of this entire field of science on cross-examination.
They went right after the science.
First, they forced Oberg to admit on the stand that the field of tool mark analysis lacks any standardized quantitative criteria for determining what constitutes sufficient agreement. It's not like DNA where you get a 1 in a billion mathematical probability. It relies entirely on the examiner's subjective visual evaluation through a microscope. She just looks at it and says, yes, that's a match.
And the defense raised an even more critical fundamental mechanical issue regarding the force involved.
Exactly. The bullet found at the crime scene was unspent. It had never been fired. It had just been cycled through the gun. But when the state's forensic technicians initially tried to replicate those exact tool marks in the lab by manually racking live cartridges through Allen's gun, just pulling the slide back by hand to eject the bullet,
It failed.
It didn't leave the marks.
no, they couldn't produce visible matching marks. The only way the technicians could generate marks severe enough to match the crime scene bullet was by actually firing test rounds through the firearm.
The defense argued that this completely invalidates the science. They argued that matching a pristine, unspent round found in the dirt to marks generated by the violent, explosive, high-pressure discharge of a fired weapon is scientifically unreliable. You are comparing apples to oranges in terms of kinetic force and chamber pressure. The physics don't align.
Not to mention, the defense pointed out that the crime scene investigators completely failed to take any in situ photographs, meaning pictures of the bullet exactly as it lay in the dirt, before they dug it out.
They just picked it up.
They just plucked it from the ground, which raises massive contamination and chain of custody concerns. But despite all of these scientific and procedural issues, the jury was hyper-focused on this single piece of brass. During their deliberations, they asked 13 separate questions, specifically regarding the bullet and the extractor marks.
And you have to remember the context of those deliberations. With the alternative suspects, the Odinism, and the catfishing completely locked out of the courtroom by the judge, the jury had an incredibly narrow set of facts to consider.
They didn't hear any of the other stuff.
Right, they had the state's narrative, the misfiled tip placing him on the bridge, the subjective bullet match, and those agonizing recorded solitary confinement confessions.
It leads us to the culmination of this immense process, the verdict. The trial officially began on October 18, 2024. Over 21 grueling days of testimony, the state argued that Richard Allen forced the girls off the bridge at gunpoint, marched them down the hill, and murdered them.
And the defense pushed back hard.
The defense highlighted the complete lack of Allen's DNA at the scene, the unreliability of the ballistics, and the coercive nature of his detention. The jury deliberated for roughly 19 to 20 hours over 3 days, and on November 11, 2024, they returned to the courtroom with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder.
The sentencing hearing, which took place on December 20, 2024, brought the intense focus back to where it started, the victims' families. It brought the focus back to the specific backgrounds of the people who have suffered the most profound loss in this entire saga. 6 relatives delivered deeply emotional victim impact statements to the court.
Abby's grandfather, Eric Erskine, gave a statement that really conceptualizes the permanence of this kind of grief. He compared the loss of Abby to, quote, losing a limb that never grows back. You just have to learn to function without a piece of yourself.
It's heartbreaking.
And Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, spoke heartbreakingly about the profound, lasting, irrational guilt she carries every single day over simply allowing the girls to visit the trail that afternoon. The emotional weight in that courtroom was described as suffocating, and Judge Gall, staring down from the bench, calling these some of the most heinous calculated crimes she had ever presided over, sentenced Richard Allen to 2 consecutive maximum terms of 65 years, 130 years in state prison, a functional death sentence.
Which brings us to the present day, the summer of June 2026, and the concrete physical updates on the people involved in this sprawling narrative, because the story didn't end with a gavel drop.
Where is he now?
For his own safety and due to his high-profile status, Richard Allen is actually no longer incarcerated in the state of Indiana. In July 2025, under an interstate compact agreement, he was transferred out of state.
Let me define that really quickly. An interstate compact agreement is a formal contract between states that allows them to transfer inmates across state lines, usually for security reasons or to manage prison populations.
Right.
It's rare for an inmate to be moved this far, but given the notoriety of the case, Allen was moved to the Lexington Assessment and Reception Center in Oklahoma.
But the legal battle over his conviction is far from over. His defense team immediately filed their formal appeal, and the Court of Appeals of Indiana has officially granted their request for oral arguments. Those pivotal arguments are scheduled for September 21st, 2026 at the Indiana State House in Indianapolis.
What exactly are they arguing? What are the mechanisms of this appeal?
The defense is resting their entire appellate strategy on 3 main structural pillars. First, they are attacking the validity of the October 2022 search warrant that yielded the gun.
Why was the warrant invalid?
They argue the warrant was unconstitutional because law enforcement intentionally omitted those conflicting eyewitness descriptions we discuss, like Betsy Blair describing a boyish suspect instead of a 52-year-old man from the affidavit.
Okay. What's the second pillar?
Second, they are challenging the admissibility of the confessions. They will argue to the appellate judges that the 13 months in solitary confinement was legally coercive and that the jury was unfairly prejudiced by being shown a muted video of his psychological breakdown.
And the third?
And third, perhaps most significantly, they are appealing the exclusion of the Odinism defense. They assert that Judge Gall violated Allen's fundamental Sixth Amendment right to present a complete defense by completely blocking them from telling the jury about Brad Holder, the ritualistic staging, and the Fehu rune.
So after parsing through the autopsy reports, the digital footprints, the misfiled tips, and the prison psychology, what does this all mean? When we look back at the specific people we've profiled today, we see a picture that is vastly more complex and frankly more disturbing than a neatly packaged true crime narrative.
It's not neat at all.
We started with the tragic, physical reality of 2 young girls, Abby and Libby, and the brutal staging of their bodies. We looked at a retired volunteer, Kathy Shank, whose sharp eye caught a clerical error in a sea of 14,000 tips. We looked at the background of a convicted online catfisher, the digital footprint of an alleged Odinist, a prison psychologist listening to true crime podcasts on her commute, and a 52-year-old pharmacy tech who broke down and ate his own Bible in solitary confinement.
Looking at all these individuals forces you to consider how entirely subjective human behavior truly is, and how that subjectivity forms the bedrock of the justice system.
It really does.
A witness changing the color of a coat in their memory over 3 weeks. A forensic examiner deciding that a microscopic scratch on a piece of brass is a definitive, undeniable match. A psychologist interpreting a confession delivered by a man covered in feces and vomit as logical and organized. These highly subjective human interpretations, prone to error and bias, are what ultimately decided a man's fate and closed a case.
It really brings us back to that X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning. As a society, we desperately want the justice system to be a clean, undeniable break. We want a binary guilty or not guilty based on irrefutable physics and flawless police work.
But that's just a fantasy here.
Right. What we actually have here in the Delphi case is a murky, chaotic landscape built on shifting human memory, profound administrative error, and catastrophic psychological breakdown.
And that reality leaves us with a final, very provocative thought to mull over as we approach these crucial appellate hearings in the fall of 2026.
What's that?
If the appellate court decides in September that Judge Gulf fundamentally erred, if they decide that the Constitution demands the jury should have been allowed to hear the entire story about Brad Holder, the stick structures, Ron Logan, and the blood-drawn Fay Hurun, we may not just be looking at the logistical nightmare of a new trial for Richard Allen.
No. If that happens, we might be looking at an entirely new mandated investigation into a town that has already spent nearly a decade tearing itself apart. The muddy waters of Delphi might just get infinitely deeper.